The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the hum of whispered conversations and the shuffle of papers. Reporters, legal professionals, and spectators filled the seats, all eager for the day's proceedings. It was just another high-profile case in the long line of trials Judge Eleanor Carter had presided over. She had been on the bench for over 20 years, respected by her colleagues and feared by those who tried to manipulate the system. Her career was built on her ability to remain impartial and unwavering, a trait that made her a formidable force in the courtroom. But today, as Eleanor sat behind her bench, listening to the murmurs from the gallery and reviewing the case in front of her, something felt different. It wasn't until the defendant was led into the courtroom that the feeling solidified into shock. Marcus Hayes, the accused, walked in shackled and silent, flanked by 2 officers. His face was downcast, his expression unreadable. He avoided eye contact with the judge, his posture slumped as though he had already accepted his fate. His eyes scanned the room, but they passed over Eleanor without a flicker of recognition. The judge studied him as he stood before her waiting for the proceedings to begin. And then it hit her like a wave crashing over her. Marcus. It was him. The room seemed to blur around her as her heart began to race. The name came rushing back to her. Marcus Hayes. Her childhood best friend. The boy who had always been there for her, who had protected her from bullies, who had been her partner in crime during their carefree younger years. He had been her closest companion until one day, without any warning, he had vanished from her life. She had heard rumors over the years about his troubled past, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that this man, now standing before her in handcuffs, was the same boy she had once shared everything with. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, and her hand instinctively reached for the gavel. She knew she had to remain composed, but the flood of memories, the laughter, the shared secrets, the bond they had once had, was overwhelming. She had known Marcus as a child, full of promise and potential. He had always been there for her when others weren't, standing up to the bullies who had tormented her. He was strong, protective, and fiercely loyal. And now, here he was, accused of a crime that seemed so far removed from the boy she had known. Her mind raced as the courtroom continued with the usual formalities. The attorneys for both sides spoke in turn, presenting their cases. But Eleanor couldn't focus. She barely heard the accusations against Marcus, the details of the charges, or the gravity of the situation. All she could think about was the past, the Marcus who had once saved her from the cruel kids in their neighborhood, the Marcus who had promised to always look out for her, no matter what. The realization of who he had become, who he was now, was a harsh and jarring contrast to the memories she held dear. She struggled to process the dissonance between the boy she had known and the man standing in front of her. How had it come to this? How had their lives diverged so drastically? Eleanor cleared her throat, trying to regain her composure, but it was no use. Her mind was overwhelmed by the collision of past and present. She had to make a decision, but for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure how to proceed. How could she balance the duties of a judge with the personal history she had with this man? How could she be impartial when her own emotions were clouding her judgment? The gavel trembled in her hand, and she knew that whatever decision she made next would not only affect Marcus's fate, but would also force her to confront the choices she had made and the person she had become. As the trial continued, Eleanor's thoughts constantly wandered back to the memories of her and Marcus's childhood. They had been inseparable once, best friends who grew up together in a struggling neighborhood, both of them fighting against the odds. In those days, life had seemed full of possibility. They had shared everything, their dreams, their secrets, and their frustrations with a system that had done little to help kids like them. Eleanor remembered how Marcus had always looked out for her. He had been the one to stand up for her when bullies tried to take advantage of her. He had defended her from every punch thrown, every cruel word said. She had never forgotten how protective he had been, even when the rest of the world seemed to turn a blind eye to them. They had been more than friends. They had been each other's lifeline. But as the years passed, their paths diverged. While Eleanor focused on her studies, determined to make something of herself, Marcus had fallen victim to the very system she was now part of. His family had abandoned him, and the city had neglected him. Without the right support, Marcus had been left behind, slipping deeper into the cracks of society. Eleanor went on to law school, becoming the respected judge she was today, while Marcus, she later learned, had been arrested for petty crimes, his life spiraling out of control. The realization was a bitter pill to swallow. She had worked hard to get where she was, fighting against a system that had also tried to hold her back, but in the back of her mind she couldn't help but wonder. What if she had done more for Marcus? What if their paths had stayed intertwined? What if, instead of becoming a judge, she had become someone who could have helped him, kept him from becoming the man standing trial now? Eleanor tried to focus on the present as the trial continued. Marcus was being accused of armed robbery and assault. The evidence seemed circumstantial at best, but the prosecutor was relentless, demanding the maximum sentence for a man with a lengthy criminal record. The charges seemed out of character for the Marcus she had known. The man before her didn't seem like the same boy who had once helped her escape from bullies. But as she looked at his hardened face, the years of pain, the disillusionment in his eyes, she realized how much the world had failed him. The courtroom tension was palpable. Marcus sat in the defendant's chair, his posture slouched, his eyes downcast. His public defender argued that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time, that he had been caught up in the wrong crowd. But Marcus's criminal record, full of past mistakes, made it difficult to believe his story. The prosecution was pushing for a harsh sentence, citing his history and the serious nature of the charges. As the trial broke for a recess, Eleanor found herself lost in thought. She couldn't let the past cloud her judgment, but it was hard not to. How had things gone so wrong for Marcus? She had worked so hard to escape the life they had both been born into, but Marcus had been left behind. He had been a victim of the system she now helped run. She had never imagined he would end up here, in front of her, as a defendant in her court. Unable to shake the overwhelming emotions swirling inside her, Eleanor did something she hadn't done before. She broke protocol. She stood up, excusing herself from the bench, and walked out of the courtroom. She headed straight to the holding area, where Marcus was being kept during the break. She knew it was against the rules to speak to the defendant outside of court, but she couldn't ignore the pull in her heart. She had to speak to him. When she reached the small room where Marcus sat, his eyes met hers. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The weight of the years that had passed between them hung in the air. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice rough but sincere. "You were always meant for something bigger, Eleanor," he said, his eyes not meeting hers. "Me? I never had a chance." Eleanor felt a pang of guilt, the kind that comes with realizing you can never undo the mistakes of the past. "That's not true," she replied, her voice shaking. "I should have been there for you. I should have helped you. Marcus's gaze lifted, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, he looked directly at her. His expression was filled with pain and something deeper, something that Eleanor hadn't seen in years. You couldn't have known, Eleanor. The system was always stacked against me. Eleanor swallowed hard, trying to fight the tears threatening to break through. Maybe, but I should have tried harder. I should have been the one to help you. I'm sorry. Marcus didn't answer right away, but he nodded. He didn't seem angry, just resigned. It's not too late, he said quietly, his words holding a weight that neither of them was ready to fully comprehend. As the conversation ended, the distance between them, the years that had passed, felt both insurmountable and yet strangely surmountable. Eleanor was left with a deep realization. The system she had worked so hard to be a part of had failed Marcus. And it wasn't just his fault. It was the fault of a broken system. And it was time for that system to change. As the trial resumed, Eleanor sat behind her bench, the weight of her responsibilities heavy on her shoulders. The room felt colder than it had when the trial first started, and she could feel the pressure building inside her. She had to make a decision, one that would change the course of Marcus's life forever. Her mind raced, torn between what she knew was legally correct and what her heart urged her to do. She had seen so many cases like this, cases where justice had been skewed by the systems that seemed built to keep people like Marcus trapped. Marcus had been accused of armed robbery and assault, a man with a criminal record that suggested guilt in the eyes of many. The evidence against him seemed damning, yet something felt wrong. Her memories of Marcus, his face as a boy, so full of potential, haunted her. It was hard for her to reconcile the young man she saw in front of her now with the best friend she had lost. How had he gotten here? Was this truly his path? Or had the very systems she had once fought to be a part of failed him, failed them both? She forced herself to focus on the trial. The prosecution's arguments were solid in a legal sense. They spoke about his past convictions, his prior involvement with the law. But Eleanor knew better than anyone that past mistakes didn't define a person. They didn't define Marcus, and they certainly didn't tell the full story. As the prosecutor wrapped up his case, Eleanor prepared to give her verdict. She had to deliver justice according to the law. She had to. But her conscience, her deep-rooted sense of fairness, kept whispering that the law wasn't always the same as justice. She could feel the eyes of the courtroom on her, waiting for her decision, and with each passing second, it grew harder to silence the voice in her head that urged her to dig deeper, to look harder. Just as she opened her mouth to speak, something interrupted the tension. The doors to the courtroom swung open, and a young lawyer rushed in, holding a folder with new evidence. The room fell into silence as everyone turned their attention to the newcomer. He approached the bench, and without a word, handed the file to Eleanor. She opened it quickly, scanning the contents. A new security tape had surfaced. A nearby store's camera had recorded the scene in question. The footage revealed something Eleanor hadn't anticipated. Marcus hadn't been attacking anyone. He had been trying to stop the situation from escalating. He had intervened between two other men who were fighting, attempting to de-escalate the violence, and had only been caught in the crossfire. It was clear from the tape that he was trying to help, not harm. The room was hushed as the full scope of the new evidence hit everyone in the courtroom. Eleanor looked at Marcus, his face a mixture of exhaustion and hope. He had been fighting against the narrative that had been built around him, a narrative that painted him as a criminal, as someone who deserved to be punished. But here was the truth, uncovered, undeniable, and stark in its simplicity. For a moment, Eleanor was frozen in place. The world around her seemed to stop. She looked at the footage again, and for the first time in years, she felt a wave of certainty. This was what justice looked like. Not the verdict she had been about to deliver, but the one that would come from the truth. The law wasn't about following procedures blindly. It was about understanding the whole story, seeing people for who they truly were. Eleanor stood, her heart pounding in her chest as she glanced at Marcus. He looked at her with those same trusting eyes from their youth, and in that moment she knew what she had to do. She cleared her throat, her voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm her. After reviewing the new evidence, I find Marcus Hayes not guilty of the charges against him, she declared firmly. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The murmurs grew louder, with some members of the jury looking stunned, others relieved. Marcus's eyes widened in disbelief, but he didn't say a word. The bailiff, who had been standing by, immediately moved to unlock Marcus's handcuffs. The courtroom buzzed with astonishment and relief, but all Marcus could focus on was Eleanor. As the handcuffs were removed, Marcus turned to Eleanor, his voice quiet but filled with gratitude. "Thank you for seeing me," he whispered, his words raw with emotion. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes, but she fought them back. The years of holding on to the past, the guilt, the anger, the questions about how things had gone wrong, finally they began to fade. In that moment, Marcus wasn't the man in front of her now. He was the boy she had known, the boy who deserved a chance, a fair chance, at redemption. And she had given it to him. As Marcus walked out of the courtroom, a free man, the courtroom's atmosphere was charged with a sense of change. Marcus's story was far from over, but his future had just been altered in the most profound way. Eleanor watched him leave, her mind at peace for the first time in a long while. She had delivered the right verdict. Justice wasn't just about the law, it was about understanding, compassion, and second chances. And maybe, just maybe, she had made a difference today. The courtroom had emptied, but the weight of the moment lingered in the air. Eleanor stood alone for a moment, watching Marcus leave, the sound of his footsteps echoing in her mind. He was free, but more than that, she had given him something precious, something that for so long she had denied him, and countless others like him. A second chance. Eleanor had always believed in the law, in the importance of structure and order. But now, after everything she had seen, after seeing the man Marcus had become, how could she ignore the human side of justice? The side that recognized people for who they were, not for the mistakes they made long ago. She had once written off Marcus as a statistic, another unfortunate soul lost to the system. But in the end, she had realized that his story was far from over. The very next day, Eleanor reached out to Marcus, determined to help him rebuild his life. She called him into her office and, with a quiet but firm conviction, offered him a way out of the life he had once known. She introduced him to a social justice program she had worked with over the years, an initiative aimed at providing resources and mentorship to former convicts who sought to rehabilitate themselves. This was no easy path, but Eleanor believed it was the right one for Marcus. Marcus accepted the offer, his heart full of gratitude. He had faced so many obstacles in his life, but now, thanks to Eleanor's intervention, he had a chance to rewrite his future. He started attending the program slowly but surely, working to turn his life around. With the guidance of mentors, he found a job at a local community center, where he began mentoring young boys and girls who had been through similar struggles. Marcus was no longer a symbol of failure. He was becoming a beacon of hope. Weeks passed, and one day Eleanor walked into a cafe she frequented, a small, quiet spot where she could find peace after long days in court. She sat down at her usual table, lost in thought. As she glanced around the room, she saw Marcus sitting across the room, his head bent over a notebook. He didn't notice her at first, so she took the opportunity to admire how far he had come. His once somber face was now filled with purpose, his posture more confident. When their eyes met, Marcus smiled, and Eleanor couldn't help but smile back. He stood up and walked over to her, pulling out the chair and sitting down across from her. The years seemed to melt away, and in that moment, they were just two friends catching up. There were no more judgments, no more walls between them. Just two people who had found their way back to each other, despite everything that had separated them. "I didn't think this day would come," Marcus said softly, his voice tinged with disbelief. "That I'd be sitting here with you again." Eleanor nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "I didn't either," she admitted. "But we both needed a second chance. I'm working with kids now," Marcus said, his eyes lighting up with pride. "Trying to help them avoid the same mistakes I made. It's hard, but it feels right. I never thought I'd get the chance to do this." Eleanor smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "You're doing good work, Marcus, and I'm proud of you." The conversation flowed easily, the two of them reminiscing about old times, laughing like they hadn't in years. They talked about their hopes and dreams, their regrets, and their triumphs. For the first time, Eleanor saw the boy she had once known, the boy with the spark of determination that never truly died. As they finished their coffee, Marcus looked at her, his eyes full of gratitude. "You know, if it weren't for you, I don't know where I'd be. You didn't just save my life that day in the courtroom. You gave me a chance to really live." Eleanor reached out, placing a hand on his. "You saved yourself, Marcus. I just helped you see it." They both sat in silence for a moment, allowing the weight of their words to settle. The years of tension, regret, and confusion had been replaced by something lighter, something filled with the possibility of a better future. It was a future neither of them could have imagined when they were children, but it was a future that was finally within reach. As they stood to leave, Marcus turned to her one last time. "I'm going to keep doing this, Eleanor. I'm going to keep helping these kids. They deserve a chance, too." Eleanor smiled, the tears in her eyes a mix of joy and pride. "I know you will. And I'll be right there, supporting you every step of the way." As they walked out of the cafe, their path ahead was clear. They weren't just two people who had come together after years of separation. They were two people who had learned the true meaning of redemption. And together, they would make sure that others got the second chances they deserved too. Sometimes, justice isn't just about the law, Eleanor thought to herself as they walked into the bright, hopeful future. It's about recognizing the humanity in those we've left behind,